Today, let's make a shamrock quilt block. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are making a shamrock quilt block. Now this came from a free pattern I found online. The link is in the description. For it, you will need 12 3.5-inch squares. Now I split these out into 3 different colors, so 4 of each of those squares. Then you are going to need, from like a lighter color, you're going to want 9 2 3/8-inch squares, so that's all the same. And then you're going to want 2 5.5-inch squares of the lighter color, and then 1 6.5-inch square of the big one. So you can see that that big green is kind of like my base, and then I'm placing down one of these white smaller squares on top of it so those corners and the upper right hand side match. And then I'm just going to draw a line, and we are going to be then sewing along that line. So the way that would work is then you'd fold it up, and then you almost have like a stem for our shamrock. And then I'm just going to repeat this for the bottom as well. So adding that other larger white square that I cut out, and then marking where a line would go down that diagonal. And then we will be sewing both of those lines in place, so then we get this kind of fun shape that would be like the stem for our shamrock. So now I'm just going to set that aside, and I'm going to do very similar items for these green and other white squares. So I'm going to take one of the green and match it with one of the white in the upper right hand corner, and then draw a line at the diagonal, and then repeat this for 2 more of the green and white using one of the colors of the green. Now in the pattern it just has you using one green color. Since I did use 3 green colors, what I'm going to be doing is I have this one left over. I'm going to put that to the side, and then I'm going to repeat these steps for the other 2 green colors, so then I'll have 3 pieces left over that do not have a white that I'm including on them. Then I have all of these all drawn up ready to go, and I'll just take them over to my sewing machine, and I am just going to be sewing along that line that I drew for all of the diagonals. Now for this step, I did do all of the sewing at one time, and then once I had it all done is then when I brought everything back over and started to cut them apart so that they could all be separated out. And then I just took my scissors, and for each of the little squares I just went through and snipped them so that they could each be their own separate individual item, and then I set them to the side, as now what we need to do is we need to really begin the process of turning these into our little pieces of our shamrock. So to do that, you're going to be taking one of your shamrocks and you're going to be lining up a ruler so that there is like a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then you're just going to be cutting it off. So you want to make sure you're not cutting into the seam. You want to be sure that you can see on mine that when you fold this over, you now just get one square. So this gives you kind of that fun little effect that we'll be using to put together our entire shamrock. But I'm just going to go through, and for each of those seams that I was able to sew, just cut off that extra fabric, being sure I'm leaving a 1/4-inch seam allowance, including for this big one. And then this is going to be our stem of our shamrock, so it's turning out really well. I love how it looks, and then I'm just going to press all of these out. So making sure they're nice and flat and smooth, and of course you could have done this for each of the times where if you did like one and then went over and pressed it. I just like to do them all at once, so it's a little bit faster for myself. So once you have that done, you can start to actually lay these out, and you can see what they're going to look like. So you can see how it comes together to be the shamrock shape. Now for those ones that do not have any of the white, I'm putting them in the middle, so that is how we get our shamrock look, so that the white is all around the corners. And now we're going to be matching these up in pairs, so we're going to ignore the stem and just match each of these up into pairs so that's easier to sew. So I'm just going to go through, match with right sides together, and then pin along that bottom edge for each of these pieces. And then once I get all of that paired up, I can bring it over to my sewing machine and then take a 1/4-inch seam allowance. So now I'm going to just repeat those steps for each of these little mini squares if you want, and then we're going to go and just sew all of these so that we can begin the next process. Now for this, I took a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and that's the size that you want to use for the sewing. If you have difficulties with these, you can get a 1/4-inch quilting foot, and I can include a link in case you're interested. I found for this one though, I was able to pretty much see where that 1/4-inch seam allowance was going to be. So now they're all sewn up, I can go through, I can press them out, and then I relayed them out so that I could see what they're going to look like. And now it's just time to start matching them again. So as you can see, this quilt block has a lot of sewing and then matching, sewing and then matching. So I'm going to take one of these mini blocks and then match it so that those seam allowances match up and those seams kind of come to a point exactly. And then I'm just going to be right here where you can see that those seam allowances come together, I'm putting a quilting clip, and then I'm just going to put a quilting clip at the left side and the right side, and then I'll just be taking a seam all along there. And then I will be repeating these steps for the other two leaves of our shamrock so that everything can come together. And then once you have all of that nice and pinned up, we'll then be going over to our sewing machine and taking those final 3 seams for each of these little leaf blocks. And then this is again using that 1/4 inch seam allowance and then just taking a straight stitch to bring all of this together. So really the entire name of this game with the shamrock is just kind of sewing, coming back, sewing, and coming back. So now that I have each of those leaf mini blocks done, I'm just going to be matching these with right sides together, really paying attention for the one on the left where you have the 2 leaves coming together, where the seams are so that you can make sure that they match up and it looks nice and even. And then I'm just going to be putting my quilting clips on it so that I can then take a seam all the way across. And then at this step, we are attaching our other leaf to the stem piece. So for this one, you don't necessarily need to worry as much about if it's matching the seams since one is a stem and one's that leaf, but you are going to be sewing that together so that you can have your 2 halves of the quilt block ready to go. And then once you have those completed, you're just going to be matching it with right sides together, folding it over, and then pinning it up along that long edge, and then you'll be taking a seam. So this is actually the final seam of this quilt block. So once you get done with this, you will have your quilt block all done and it's ready to go. I really thought that this was a fun quilt block. At the end, it does measure to be around 12.5 inch unfinished square. So once you get that done, you can do what you like with these. So I made 4 and turned them into a tiny wall hanging. You could definitely turn this into a table runner. You could also just make one and then maybe turn it into a tiny pillow. That could be really fun for your house. If you enjoyed this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.